name is Elena Trubina. I am formerly a professor of social theory at Ural Federal University in Russia, and now a research fellow here at UNC at Chapel Hill, namely at the Center for Slavic Eurasian and East European Studies. I'm also affiliated with Global Studies department here at UNC, where I'll teach a course on destroyed cities and reconstruction of cities next spring. And before I begin, I would like to raise two housekeeping issues. First is that we would like to make a video recording of this session. And so if there is anyone who disagrees with that, it's a good time to say it. And I also want to encourage everyone to ask questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom. And that's basically all when it comes to organizational matters. So the goal of this roundtable is to bring more voices to the table, interact with each other. We haven't seen each other for a while, and I explain later why it does matter. Play of ideas regarding the ways to speak about the countries participating in the ongoing war, one way or another. The roundtable we have today is also envisioned as a teaser of sorts for the larger conference that we plan to have next year, namely in April here at UNC. It's going to be held in a hybrid mode. And the tentative title of this planned conference, larger conference, is Diasporized Civil Society in Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, Ukraine, Belarus and Russia. And we plan to consider the political and, if you wish, existential impact of the Russian war on Ukraine. So our kind of stance here is that while civic position of the Ukrainian people is expressed on the front, in Belarus and Russia, there is no space for civic activity. Repressions intensify, and only a few semi-underground organizations basically survived. However, grassroots activism and human rights organizations continue to operate. And it's kind of tricky even to figure it out what concepts, what notions can be used to analyze this very gray zone situations. And moreover, when you begin kind of Googling or use library research to see whether there is a recent writing on the situation in Belarus, you see that there are just really few articles devoted to the protests of the last massive protests that took place in Belarus. And the question emerges, whether do we know enough about the ongoing scholarly activities, whether do we know enough about the ongoing reflection of the changes that the country undergoes, quite dramatic changes. Let me also say a few words about why these experts, why these participants will be speaking today. All of us, one way or another, are affiliated with European Humanities University, which emerged 30 years ago in Minsk, which was founded by the group of enthusiasts hoping to provide high quality humanities education for the new Belarus. History judged otherwise, and after some years of existence of this university in Minsk, it had to become exile university because the government of Lukashenko did not extend the license for this university to operate in Belarus under the pretext that it's a beacon of bourgeois freedom, liberty, things which early enough were not considered necessary for Belarus development. And so after a while, this university started its existence in Vilnius. And actually, all of us, me and 5 participants today, to repeat one way or another, are linked to this university. I taught there as a visiting professor for about 15 years. Felix, Almira, and Pavel Tereshkovich, importantly, decided to challenge the administration of this university just now by joining the election campaign, the competition to take the position of the provost. Andrei and Almira are professors of this university. So why it is important is because one of the foci of today's roundtable is what kind of knowledge is in principle possible to produce about today's Belarus. Do we have to radically reconsider the concepts that we conventionally, traditionally use to make sense of the ongoing political, economic, and social changes, including civil society, even with a twist, diasporized civil society? Or if we started looking for new concepts capable of grasping the dramatic, tragic changes that the countries neighboring Ukraine undergo, what are these concepts? What are the main arguments that we can use to better understand what's happening, both when it comes to everyday practices of people who stay in Belarus, and also the strategies of survival, of coping with numerous challenges characteristic for those people who decided or were forced to flee the country. So with this, I'm sorry for my voice today. With this, I suggest first to have a round of introductions and preliminary statements in a following order. So women's first, so Snezhana, Almira, Pavel, Felix, and Andrei, each of you have 5 to 6 minutes. So Snezhana, floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. No, maybe I will speak in English shortly. I'm a former lecturer from the Belarusian National Technical University. Until February of this year, I taught political science there. But however, I was fired for participating in a video shoot with several other teachers and students from this university in 2020, in the autumn of 2020. And some later, this year, I have to leave this university, and also this summer I came under political persecution in Belarus, and due to personal circumstances, I had to stay in Belarus, and I live here. But like some of my other colleagues in a similar situation, I applied for grant to conduct special research, to have some work. And a positive response has already arrived, and my research concerns changes in the programs of social humanitarian disciplines in secondary, in school and secondary and higher educational institution in Belarus. And more specifically, my research concerns the ideological transformation of state policy in the educational system in Belarus from 2020 till now. No, maybe in short, that's all.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I have some question. Maybe some question, no?
Снежана, можете рассказать поподробнее, почему вы в Минске, как вам кажется, там, ну или, может быть, давайте это оставим на более позднюю фазу этого круглого стола. Было бы очень здорово, если бы вы рассказали о том, что вы видите на минских улицах, почему вы сама остались в этом городе. Видите ли вы какое-то сходство между своей практической ситуацией и ситуацией тех людей, кого вы видите рядом с собой и так далее. То есть, когда первый круг представления пройдет, было бы очень хорошо, если бы вы затронули тему повседневной жизни в этом городе, учитывая, что вы у нас одна участница, кто каждый день по этим минским улицам, когда-то любимым, ходит. Хорошо?
Okay.
Альмира, пожалуйста.
Well, hello everyone, and I would like to start with saying thanks to Elena for inviting me and other colleagues to join the seminar. Elena already briefly introduced our university and each of us, but probably I should say a few words more about it. Yeah, that's right. European Humanities University, in which I have been working since the end of the 90s, became the Lithuanian university, but actually it is mostly known as Belarusian University in Exile in 2005. And so it's already more than 17 years that we are working in Lithuania vis-a-vis, I think it was 12 years in Belarus, and so now 17 years in Lithuania. And so we used to be in exile. And for many people who found themselves in really dramatic circumstances after the beginning of the political repressions starting from August 2020, exile became many actually found themselves in exile. And I don't know whether you have some idea about the figures. There is no way to calculate how many people exactly are now, moved from Belarus and are now living in different countries, from Georgia to Lithuania, Poland, etc. But according to some estimations, this might be something between 300,000 and 1 million. So it's, unfortunately, I cannot provide any exact figures, but that's the situation. We are speaking about just 2 years that passed from 2020 up to 2022, and then so many people unfortunately cannot live anymore in Belarus and should find some way how to survive, but also how to cope psychologically and how to continue also political struggle, but now from abroad. And so why I'm saying it is because, as I said, for each youth, the situation of exile became, this state of exception, as Agamben would have said, became a kind of really something that continues already for many years. Belarus is the state of exception, but for us, this extraordinary way of functioning became somehow a daily routine. Certainly in 2020, me and my colleagues, we shared hopes, and we really believed, at least I remember very well that moment in the end of the August, that quite soon HU will return to Belarus, and that will be like the end of the story of exile. But then it didn't happen, and on the contrary, due to this massive flows of migrants migrants, of refugees, let's say, from Belarus, we have now many more students in EHU than it was a year ago and 2 years ago. And now actually EHU became a kind of now arch for all of those people who lost their homes, but there is a Belarusian university in exile that has been already functioning for so many years in Lithuania. Yes, and so it actually means that it's possible to provide education in exile. It's difficult and challenging, of course, but it's possible. And secondly, also, I must say that for many years, even until 2020, it had been quite complicated to conduct research in Belarus, despite some periods of political liberalization, as we might see it from now. Still, it was quite problematic to conduct, for instance, empirical research or to publish anything that would be a form of critical analysis of Belarusian authorities. So again, for us, that what happened from 2020 till 2022 in terms of the strengthening of political repressions. This has been maybe shocking and continues to be shocking, but not unusual. That's something that during 28 years of this political regime, many people already experienced before 2020. And what else I can say? Probably, yes, also probably just one more remark about our university and about this particular moment in which we live now. Certainly after the beginning of military aggression of Russia against Ukraine, the situation in the university also became quite dramatic, in a sense that now we have not only new students who are arriving to EHU. They are not predominantly, I mean, they're still predominantly Belarusian students. We have about 85% of Belarusians, but more and more students come from Ukraine and from Russia for understandable reasons. And then, of course, you can also imagine that this causes not interpersonal conflicts, but that's a question of the language politics and the politics of knowledge inside the university. So that's something that I just wanted to mention as a part of the situation. Yes, and as for myself, I'm professor of the Department of Social Sciences, and I teach at the BA program in Media and Communication, as well as a master program on gender studies. And actually, I am the academic director of this gender studies MA program. And quite understandably, large part of my research also on Belarus has to do with the research on the relation between authoritarianism and patriarchy. And of course, if we will talk about it later, then of course I can share some of my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, now it's my turn. Nice to meet you, and nice to meet you again. And that's me. I'm Pavel Tereshkovich. I'm Belarusian historian, anthropologist, and last year I engaged a little in political science. Currently, I'm a visiting researcher in Germany, in Justus Liebig University of Gießen. I had to leave Belarus 6 months ago because of the high risk of repressions. And until my departure, I worked as a head of department, ironically, of political science in the private university of University of Law and Social Economical Communications. Now I'm pushing forward the project in Germany mainly, aimed at the study of the ideology of Ruski Mir, Russian world. Due to support of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation, I conducted several webinars on this topic, and in the beginning of September, it was a big conference about the Russian world ideology. Now I'm working under the university course about Russian world. And you see, it was probably the last drop for me to decide to leave Belarus because just a few days before departure, I got information that from the September of this year in all universities in Belarus will be introduced, and now it really introduced the course under the title political economy, and those who got education in Soviet Union should understand what does it mean. And in this course is included a part under the title geopolitics. I don't know exactly how it's possible to combine political economy and geopolitics. And what is very notable that the works of Russian philosopher and at the same time Russian typical far right Alexander Dugin are included into this course as a compulsory readings. So it was the last drop for me to decide that it's time to go out from Belarus. Thank you.
Спасибо. Thank you. Felix?
It's me. Who's next? Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah, I am the colonial guy in the setting because I am from Germany, and I spent quite some time learning Russian and Belarusian, and I did in-depth research on the history of Grodno. And after this, I came to EHU, and I want to share just one experience that, as a result of Corona and also of my incapability to jump into the events in 2020, I haven't been to Belarus for 3 years right now, and I think this is among the structural problems why I totally misunderstood important aspects of what was going on in 2020, and most like the worst case moment was when people started to name state services, police in Minsk, which special police units called OMON in Russian started to be called Gestapo, and the main interrogation prison in Okrestina Street was compared to Oswiecim or to Auschwitz. And I felt an obligation to say that Auschwitz was something different as a German historian who did research on the Holocaust in Belarus. And I started to explain that the German version of fascism was something totally different. And I think there was a problem that I did it via Facebook, not being in the streets and not doing research, like not being able to do research as I did when I wrote my book on Grodno, where I spent most of the time actually on the way to the archive and where I had the opportunity to learn something. So what was the outcome is that I was not able to understand that this was not just a cry for help, but that it was a very concise description of reality and of a changing reality. And I looking from now, I see quite early signs on Belarus being at war, like particularly in 2021. I recognize now, looking back, that there was this radicalization, not only in regard to the protest movement and to attempts to criminalize it, to delegitimize it, and to actually to reverse this narrative of fascism towards the protest movements, claiming that they are collaborators and that there is some tradition between them and the atrocities committed during German occupation of the Western Soviet Union. But that actually there were early signs of the representatives of the regime actually already being at war on a much larger scale. And like I actually overheard when the head of the Institute of History at the Academy of Science, Lakiza, when he went to Grodno on the 22nd of June last year, like he officially claimed that the collective West is preparing for World War III. Like he was saying this in public, and it was documented on the newspaper of Grodninskaya Pravda, the former party newspaper. And like for me, it was still at this moment, I recognize that there's a problem with Lakiza, and that I will not. That I will discontinue to collaborate with people like him in the framework of the German Belarusian Historical Commission I mentioned earlier in our pre-talk. But only now, looking from today, like I can see a longer process of these type of state authorities preparing themselves for ongoing events. And of course, the most impressive outcome of this is a new narrative of a genocide of Belarusian history, which is being created by the state from above and being implemented with the help of the general state attorney, with a lot of symbolic violence, I would say, and by trying to change the meta narrative of Belarus. And now I come to your question. When I try to understand what's going on in Belarus these days, not being able to enter the country anymore, and knowing that this will be a state of like that this will not end very soon, the only thing I can do is I can be in touch with my colleagues, and I see that this is something which has to be done in a very secure way, and it cannot be shared on Facebook or other platforms as it was usually before. I can see far-reaching practices of self-securing forms of self-censorship. So I get to know much less about the situation in Belarus because people share much less. So the only way is to have some kind of private appointment via other channels like Signal. This is one important change I see, and the other change is that Belarus has changed very much because of the crash of Tut-BY. So there are no journalists left in the country who are not in prison. This is one thing. But the other thing is that these institutions, which usually did a lot of work we were used to by selecting information, by organizing it, is gone. This has been like, so Tut-BY was the most important internet portal, which was much more important than other portals in other countries, and it was crashed totally in May 2021, and some of the journalists are still in prison, most of them women. And I can see that the lack of this practices of processing reality has an impact on the way how I perceive Belarus, because I have to do this work myself by like getting through Telegram channels, by searching like all these small Obelisbalkom, Rai-Isbalkom, like small scale organizational units, and try to see how they document this ongoing genocide of the Belarusian people narrative being implemented on site. So it puts a lot of like, it is hard work, I would say, and it's not so, it limits on the one hand, there are a lot of sources being processed every day via Telegram, and we know there is a lot of information, but the way we have to process it is much more complicated than just even 1.5 years ago. And it is actually us, like we have to do the work which usually do many people in a more institutionalized way, like for instance Tut-BY formerly was able to do. So I think it's quite a challenge, and it means basically a lot of work, and I feel myself very much alienated, and also I will finish by saying that for me the most radical way of being departed from Belarus is that I could not go to Grodno for funerals of Corona victims. Like, I have to say that this is for me, all the other things are problematic for everybody. Like, I mean, that this is something I cannot somehow come to terms with, because it was from Warsaw, it was less than 300 kilometers, and it was like in a different reality because of the border being closed by now.
Thank you, Felix. Thank you. So, Andrei.
Yeah, thank you, Elena, for inviting me here. Happy to be on this discussion. I'm a social anthropologist, and I have a very mixed background, which I think I have to describe shortly so that my positionality in today's discussion will be more clear. I grew up in Mariupol in Ukraine, where most of my family lived at that time, and still some relatives are there, while a larger part of the family are refugees. I did my email research at European University at St. Petersburg, and the email was dedicated to mobility of Ukrainian senior women. So I did my fieldwork in Donetsk Oblast in 2011 to 2013, being one of the last anthropologists, I guess, working there before the start of the conflict, of the war conflict. I did my PhD on Ukraine and Romania, also in the field of urban anthropology at University of Regensburg. And I'm also collaborating since 2015 with NGOs and activists in Belarus, and my only citizenship is Belarusian. So I share all the experiences of living with a Belarusian passport. Until February of this year, I lived in Ukraine, and after the beginning of the large war, as Ukrainians say today, I've been to Kiev twice, bringing humanitarian packages from Belarusian community of Vilnius there. And actually, I wanted to address the title of today's meeting. And if you will not mind, I would share slides. That would help me be more brief as well. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Could we change it, please?
Okay, just a second. Why do you do this? I have difficulties finding it.
Maybe
you choose participants and then you enable the co-host.
Okay.
And the participants you'll see Andrei.
Yeah, just a second. Okay.
Can you try it again? I think it should be fixed now.
Okay. No, it still doesn't work. Let me try another time. Not yet. Okay, if I cannot share the screen, I can talk, and then for those who would want, I can share the slides.
Yeah, that would be great. But maybe at some point, just try. Maybe it takes a while for a system to respond, to change settings.
Okay. So yeah, why talk about Belarus today? Now, like 3 short answers. For the first answer, my starting point is Timothy Snyder's idea that the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine is a colonial war. So for this matter, non-differentiation between Belarus and Russia is as far from political and intellectual deconstruction of the empire as can be. Because if we do not differentiate, then the usual assumption is that Belarus can be discussed as if it was identical to Russia, which it is not. And differences that deserve attention are to be found in pre-2022 history, in attitudes towards war, and in political system of Belarus. The second answer on why talk about Belarus today is that Belarusian case pushes us to rethink the ideas related to nonviolent protest. So this protest that happened in 2020 in Belarus, they were in their essence nonviolent. And then it was recognized as their advantage and as their key feature that within less than 2 years, the principle of nonviolence of Belarusian protests transformed from an object of appraisal and pride into a reason for reproach addressed to Belarusians and the target of mockery in memes. I'm referring here to really existing memes about Belarusians putting off their shoes before standing on the bench and watching the protest march. Yeah, rethinking the ideas about nonviolent protest. And for third answer, I would like to share my screen. Oh, now that's possible. Super.
Yes.
Cool. My third answer was that actually the 2020s in Belarus tell not only about Belarus and Belarusians. They're also telling a lot about Europe, at least about its institution, memory, and about other different things that are primarily important outside Belarus. So that's why we have to talk about this country. And if I have 3 more minutes, I would like to go into that meaningful differences that I mentioned.
Sure.
So just to say that let's not pretend that we know everything about Belarus via knowing something about Russia. But on the other side, we should not pretend that we know nothing about Belarus, because there are some surveys, there is some research, and on the basis of that research and of the data, we can say some things and we can speak about particular consensuses within Belarusian society. And one of those consensuses is that most Belarusians are not interested in becoming part of Russia, not even on the level of confederation, let alone entering Russian Federation. And this has not changed throughout the years. The percentage of people who would like that integration was and remains marginal. It is marginal now as well. Another thing is from this pre-2022 history, it is about the scale of repressions after rigged presidential elections and mass protests. So here are numbers, but also not figures, but also apart from figures, there are specific Belarusian forms of repression that are not practiced in Russia. First of all, this is death penalty. This is deprival of citizenship for protesters. This is confiscation and arrest of property of political opponents and protesters. This is also systematic forced labor in prisons. You cannot refuse from working in Belarusian prison. And then also the last but not the least is persecution of Belarusian-speaking population in Belarus. Although 54% of population during the census, these are official data, yeah, so they mentioned that Belarusian is their mother tongue. Yeah, but you can get into prison if a policeman hears you on the street speaking Belarusian. And the last slide that I want to show now is about the scale of exodus. And here is just parts of statistics on how many people left Belarus since August 22. So most of these departures have happened before February 2022, which I think is very important. And if we put all those data all together, we can suggests that from 5 to 10% of the population left the country within less than 2 years. And there is only one country in Europe where this percentage is higher, and this country is Ukraine. And also, if we compare this to percentage of people who fled Russia after the start of the war, then differences are about 30 times. And even now, as mobilization was declared, differences are still dozen times if we speak about percentage of population. So I think there are several reasons to talk about Belarus and to talk about it specifically, not always in the linkage with some other countries.
Thank you so much, Andrei. As a follow-up to what you mentioned, there is a sense in which it's obvious today that Belarus, similar to Ukraine, must overcome the Russian imperial thinking and to reconsider its place in the region of Eastern Europe, but also in Europe more generally and in the world, its relations with neighbors and perhaps new formats of cooperation. But knowing that Russian troops continue arriving on Belarus territory, it's even difficult to speak about any forms of cooperation in the regional or global context. So in addition to the questions that you raised, all of you raised, I would like to pose a question about the ways to rethink the country and the Eastern European region more generally. In the flyer, we use these terms: failed state, failed country, with a lot of reservations. One can also say that there are many simply outdated notions like Slavic brotherhood. Some people, including myself, express a skepticism about the notions of the post-Soviet societies and post-socialism more generally. But as I already mentioned, it remains largely unknown whether any intellectual work has been conducted in order to find a better and recent notions, arguments, approaches that allow us to understand Belarus both in the context of Russo-Ukrainian war and in a larger historic context. Any thoughts on that?
And maybe just briefly on the notion of failed state, because I like in Germany, this notion was applied to Ukraine very much throughout the last 2 decades. And as a result, everybody, like including high level experts, assumed that that Ukraine would be gone after 2 or 3 days. So basically, they were very close to what Putin anticipated because because of a lack of knowledge, actually. So in this regard, I think it is highly problematic because it embodies the notion of a lack of agency, both on behalf of the society and also those people who are at the same time citizens and represent the state. And with agency, I mean here the capacity to self-organize, to react to reality, to have a sense of reality, to share it and to come to terms with it as a collective. And in my understanding, this is true for Belarus as well. The high level of repressions does not mean that Belarusian people lack this capacity, or I would even say that we should not underestimate the capacity of the Belarusian state to resist, to self-organize, to react to reality, to create their own, and so on. So in this sense, I'm very skeptical about the term failed state.
Can I?
Thank you. Sure.
I have two comments. The first one is just on this notorious brotherhood, and then I will continue to, and then I will return to the concept of failed state. Well, with brotherhood, I think it's really so terribly anachronistic, and it became such a awful cliche that are used all the time by Lukashenko, Putin, and all the like bureaucrats and representatives of these two regimes. I do think that actually this is not only not true, but also it's just completely outdated. But the funny thing is that if I'm not mistaken, during first 2 weeks probably, or after 1 month of the war, the first monument that was collapsed, it was actually the monument which was called Three Sisters, and it was located somewhere in the border, on the border, or in some part of Ukraine, on Ukrainian side, closer to Russia and Belarus. And so actually it's sisters, brothers, but as we see, actually this type of familial kin actually doesn't make any sense today. As for the failed state, actually, I agree with Felix that for some time, probably this was also the outcome or the effect of kind of media coverage. Ukraine was often mentioned as a kind of failed state. I don't think it has to do with reality or with the state of affairs, but what I had been thinking during last year at least, it's about and actually this was long before the war started and Belarus became completely occupied and became like completely satellite of Russian imperialism. When I started to think of like some time ago, as I said, on how to define properly the state run by Lukashenko, I was hesitating, and I'm still not sure about two not similar but closer concepts. One of them is a failed state, and another one is a collapsed state. Let me just develop this a little bit. Why do I think that the failed state or collapsed state, actually this might be the characteristics that are to be applied to Belarus today? Max Weber defined the state as such as maintaining a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within its borders. And we all understand that Lukashenko's regime, at least this was clear till February 2022, it was clear for people inside Belarus that Lukashenko appropriated the state in a certain sense, and he retained the power due to the unlimited use of state repressive apparatuses. And therefore it means that doing all of this, Lukashenko and Lukashenko's regime actually holds a monopoly on the use of force and violence in that very same sense as Max Weber pointed out. But the problem is, of course, the absence of the legitimacy. And Lukashenko lost his president's legitimacy entirely in 2020. And therefore, it means that in some other occasions, probably before 2020, it was not applied to Belarus, but now we see more and more reasons why the term failed state is quite often referred to the different types of dictatorships, different types of authoritarian state. And then also a few other aspects which I also notice, or which I actually think can be said about Belarus, about Belarus today as a failed state. I'm aware that there is no real consensus on the definition of failed state, and if you look to the different conceptual approaches, you will find some differences, and that's why I'm saying that there is no consensus. But still, some features or some characteristics are mentioned more than others, and among such characteristics, we usually find the the features like when the state is not able to enforce its laws uniformly, or when it's not able to provide basic goods and services to its citizens, when there is a high crime rates or extreme political corruption, impenetrable and bureaucracy, judicial ineffectiveness, and so on and so forth. And so actually not all of these characteristics may be relevant for understanding how Belarus today functions, but Belarus under Lukashenko. But still, it means that at least one of the things like the trouble with the collapse of the law, of the legal system, it's for me probably the most important thing. And I will try to make it short, but just let me briefly to mention the concept of a collapse state. This term, the collapse state or the collapsing state, is applied usually to the countries where the state apparatus completely is falling apart and the state becomes dysfunctional. So when this state dysfunction leads to the political decay. And we don't really see that probably the signs of this decay are not visible to the external, to the distant observers. But it seems to me that for Belarusians, both inside the country and those who are in exile now, the state under Lukashenko ceased to fulfill this. I mean, the state apparatus actually is falling apart. And given that Lukashenko all the time is sending completely contradictory messages. Actually, each day he says things that are just completely oppositional in sense. So then we can understand that actually the state of the state dysfunction and the state in which the bureaucracy and the repressive apparatus is functioning in Belarus today is completely incomprehensible probably, or it's just really very strange. So that's what I wanted to say about this. And just there are also other interesting things that would be interesting to discuss about the control over the information and the monopoly on the information and the monopoly on the media, etc., and so on and so forth. I just wanted to say that I do think that with the beginning of the war, Belarus became or is fallen now more under the definition of collapsing state than it was before, even after 2020.
Thank you so much. I would, unless there are other participants, experts who would like to say anything on that matter, we move further, and I wanted to return to our brief exchange with Snezhana, who is based in Minsk and who agreed to talk a little bit about the everyday life under the authoritarian Belarusian regime. What are the different ways in which ordinary citizens create relatively acceptable lifestyle in an economic, political, and cultural environment, which is characterized obviously by very strong constraints. And once again, Snezhana, whatever language you want to use, we either translate or understand. It's really up to you.
Ну, сейчас я там вроде бы окей. Очень много событий. Я перехожу уже на русский, прошу прощения. Очень много событий, как у всех из нас, происходит каждый месяц, каждый день. Ситуация так быстро меняется, поэтому даже часть событий, которые там были год назад, даже 2 года назад, уже как в таком дальнем прошлом. И скорее проще отвечать о том, что вот здесь и сейчас происходит. Но если вкратце про те изменения, которые происходили, которые происходят сейчас за последние полгода, кроме, ну, у меня просто совпало так по времени, это то, что я осталась, ну, вот, ушла со своей предыдущей работы из университета, и все вот в конце, я ушла в начале февраля, и буквально в конце февраля вот началось то, что мы сейчас все переживаем, и кроме этого, значительное число моих коллег, близких, очень друзей уезжали еще раньше, вынуждены были уезжать раньше из страны, уезжают, продолжают уезжать сейчас. То есть, ну, контакты не теряются, но понятно, что очень трудно быстро ориентироваться, ну, помогать друг другу или тем, кто уехал, или тем, кто вот остается здесь. То есть усложняется сам вот процесс жизни и тем, кто остается в Беларуси, и тем, кто вынужден был уехать. Большие сложности, как там все это знают, с получением визы и раньше это было, и вот полгода назад еще предоставлялась, наоборот, эта помощь сразу после вот событий 2020 года, но с февраля 2022 напротив, белорусов как бы все сужается, да, вот эта вот дорога возможностей для выезда из страны тем, кому это необходимо. И наоборот, возможность оставаться здесь, если как бы люди не желают следовать тому, что вот указывает сама власть. Ну, конечно, сложнее всего тем, кто вообще, ну, не сложнее всего, а как бы трудно как бы передать и понять вот те, кто как бы вынужден сидеть, кто находится там в тюрьме, кто попадает каждый день. Вот мы получаем новости, новости, вот как краткие новости из правозащитных организаций, что вот очередной политзаключенный, какие-то известные люди, опять же, те, которые работали совершенно в разных направлениях, то есть не обязательно они были политическими активистами, но вот свою позицию так как-то проявляли не знаю, там, на своей работе или просто попадались, да, вот попадались на глаз правоохранительным органам там, этой власти, и, в принципе, поэтому очень трудно сейчас найти вот какую-то логику, да, вот какую-то цепочку, которая бы все объясняла в той позиции, которую занимает вот белорусская власть сегодняшняя. То есть, скорее, это напоминает такие вот попытки, ну, выживания, попытки реагировать на такие сиюминутные реакции на вот события здесь и сейчас, а не продуманные какие-то вот планы, стратегии, тут даже тактические, да, эти вот реакции, они весьма сомнительны, да, большое сомнение вот вызывает. Но одновременно с этим, вот это все такие минусы, если говорить про плюсы, то той помощи, вот, которая вот обнаружилась, помощи друг друга, да, вот это каждодневная, которая обнаружилась именно вот в последние 2 года, как люди друг другу оказывают вместе работали, близкие друзья, дальние друзья, друг с другом незнакомые, пересекающиеся в социальных сетях, или просто помощь, да, вот, которая оказывается благодаря тем, кто организует, опять же, через эти социальные сети сбор там, средств, какой-то другой необходимой помощи для вот, пострадавших, это происходит постоянно, и вот эта вот горизонтальная цепочка связи стала, на мой взгляд, вот основной в выживании, да, и взаимопомощи вот сегодняшних белорусов. Ну, это если говорить так в целом. Если говорить о моей работе, то есть вот я ушла, как я уже говорила, уже больше, чем полгода назад оттуда, и должна сказать, что связи тут же порвались. То есть они есть такие очень точечно, так совсем чуть-чуть, возможно, потому что те, кто остается вот в государственных местах работать, ну, для себя такую, для самосохранения, для выживания, да, в этой системе, так, в какой-то степени изолируются вот те, кто выпадает, да, оттуда. Ну, или очень точечно там, на каком-то таком локальном уровне, так на близких отношениях, там люди помогают друг другу, но в основном это происходит все-таки вне этой системы и вот скорее другого типа связи, то есть не на самих работах, а вот вовне их, если говорить про государственную, да, вот эту вот часть нашей системы.
Спасибо большое, Снежана. Thank you so much. Just to briefly summarize what Snezhana said for those who have a rusty Russian, the repression machine intensifies and works randomly, so that it's difficult to predict or understand what exactly can be can provide a ground for being detained, as a result of a largely repressed environment, the horizon of planning shrunk, so that people basically resort to survival tactics, try to cope with these very difficult circumstances, and among very few good positive tendencies that may be discerned, Snezhana noticed increased solidarity and support that people connected through webs, networks of friendships provide to each other. But she was also keen to emphasize that when it comes to people who were fired from state institutions like herself, I may add myself here to this list and to the picture. When it comes to fired professionals, they very quickly become cut off of existing professional networks, administrative networks, because those who stay, those who continue working for state institutions, take precautions and sometimes deliberately, God knows how it happens, avoid communicating with their former colleagues. Those of you who have Russian, maybe you would like to add something to that. That was just a brief summary to Snezhana's account.
Thank you.
Okay, and so Pavel, I apologize for not letting you speak earlier. Perhaps you wanted to contribute to the previous round of discussion. I apologize for that. I didn't.
No, it's completely okay. Just a few words about this idea of applying this term failed state or collapsed state to Belarus. To my mind, it's an inappropriate term, and it's in some extent it's misleading. And just if we make a look to the World Index of Fragile States this year, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, Moldova, in a quite good position, in a quite good rank. It's in 69, 64, approximately something like this. And in generally a failed state, if we remember this, using these terms toward Ukraine, in Russia, and in Germany, it's a kind of metaphor, but not reality. And of course, legitimacy is very important as a part of the definition of failed state. But failed state index is a composite index, and legitimacy is just part of it. And failed state, first of all, if we hear this failed state, we imagine, first of all, some African states, but not Belarus, not Russia, not Ukraine, not Moldova, even Kyrgyzstan. And to my mind, we should also to pay attention to the definition of modern Belarus, current Belarus as occupied state, which to my mind also doesn't work, because a lot of historians were looking to find the same case for Belarus and compared to Anschluss of Austria during the Hitler regime or some kind of Franco regime in Spain. But all of these cases are not appropriate for modern Belarus, because modern Belarus is modern Belarus and nothing more. And I would like to say a few words about so-called semantic default, which was opened this year when Timothy Snyder pushed forward the discussion about what kind of regime now in Russia? Is Russia a fascist state or not? And it was a very, very acute discussion, and major participants, major experts considered that Russia is not a fascist state. But it also a question for Belarus. Belarus now is fascist state or not? And if we say that Russia is not fascist state, you see, after all these discussions, it seems to me it was kind of the deep sigh of relief. Oh, okay, Russia isn't fascist state. But I have a question. Is it better than fascism, or it wasn't fascism? How we could consider it? And to my mind, we are faced with a new type of political regimes, and all our scales, all our ideas about fascist state, totalitarian state, this is about the states of the middle of the 20th century. But we now in the beginning of the 21st century. And as for Russian ideology, it's a very interesting case. It's from the one side, the ideology which has no its own name. There are several names, and we could call it Ruski Mir, we could call it Putinism, we could call it Russism, etc. But all these terms are inappropriate. And this is ideology which has no any clear-cut corpus of ideological text like Mein Kampf or Manifesto of Communist Party and etc. This is from the one side, and from the other side, it's extraordinarily powerful ideology which could mobilize let's say it frankly and openly, that a major part of Russian population now supports the war. And it influences not only on the Russian population in Russia, but on the, I would like to say, Russian-speaking or more clear, Russian Soviet-speaking population all over the world. And there are tens of millions of such peoples, and they are not only Russian, but exactly Russian Soviet-speaking under the influence of this ideology. So, to my mind, we should elaborate some new approach and new methodology for understanding of such kind of regimes, like in Russia, like in Belarus, and the situation in the States, are they really failed or not? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I obviously have the whole bunch of questions, but I would like to open the floor now for Q&A, and whomever would like to make a comment or ask questions from our participants, please do so. Oh, Andrei, I'm sorry, I haven't noticed. I mean, this yellow hand almost merged in the background of your room, and so it was kind of difficult to notice. Apologies. Yes, please.
No reason to apologize, because I have just raised it. So
okay.
It's fine. I just wanted to comment, following up what Pavel has said, that I guess sometimes we should not overestimate the importance of classification, or finding a label for a particular country, like putting Belarus into some box. Probably today what makes more sense is comparing particular elements of this constructor, of this, I don't know, set of this assemblage, if you want. Comparing the toolkits or the possibilities that different populations have to impact the situation or to take decisions. Yeah, for instance, to compare the public opinion on war and participation of their countries in the war, or comparing the possibilities to get a visa and leave the country, or yeah, possibilities to I don't know, well, I'll just stop here, but my idea was that we sometimes should compare probably particular elements to see the differences. Yeah, a thing that I have forgotten is comparing forms of partisan resistance. And one of my favorite examples is Belaruski Gayun, which is thousands of people on the territory of Belarus informing Ukrainian side on what is going on the territory of Belarus. And this social fact that Ukraine is much more informed on movements of Russian troops on Belarusian territory than on Russian territory is also significant. Yeah, so I think sometimes these smaller things can give us also an insight into social processes that are taking place and into possible ways out of the situation.
Thank you so much. Graham, please.
So first of all, I want to thank everybody for really insightful and interesting comments and background. This is, to my mind, there's so many tragedies with Russia's latest round of invasion and aggression in Ukraine, but the situation in Belarus is one of those tragedies that we don't talk about nearly enough. And so just really wonderful to hear everyone's thoughts and comments today. I specifically wanted to follow up on, I guess, what Andrei was just saying, actually, but also what Snezhana was talking about in terms of horizontal connections and mutual help. And I wanted to hear more stories about that, but I also wanted to hear the extent to which the connections made during the protest movement of 2020 important in how Belarusian society and Belarusian people have responded to the Russian invasion. Are there, often social movements and protest movements leave remains on the ground, and I wonder to what extent that's true in Belarus, despite the massive repression, and what extent those remains have been important in the last 6 months or so. Thank you.
Is there anyone who wants to answer?
Anyone? Difficult questions.
If you to think about available figures, there are at least two to call them sociological teams conducting quantitative research, and they are indicating constantly that the support of Belarusian participation in the war is marginal. It's less than 5%. But if we are talking about which side the people support, then opinions are more divided, with no visible difference, but with like half of respondents just abstaining from the answer, so not answering anything. And so we have that quasi pro-Russian camp, some 20-25% pro-Ukrainian camp, some 30-35%, 40%, but actually, yeah, there is a large part that is just not indicating their opinion, which can easily be explained. And if we talk about the scale of repressions, also, repressions have intensified. If we look at the number of political prisoners in the country, so it is growing faster during last 8 months than it had been growing during 2021. Belarus has now around 1,700 political prisoners. And I guess that at the moment of the beginning of Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was 3 times more, probably.
In the
So,
beginning of the year, it was 1,100.
okay.
Or probably like around 1,000, and now it's 1.5.
Yeah, so I'm mistaken, but this number
You're not
keeps
mistaken, Andy.
growing.
It's just because, sorry for interrupting you, but it's just because the human rights defenders, they have quite strict criteria for defining the political prisoners, but we all know that the number is much higher. So it's like the basic number, 1.5 or 1.7.
Yeah, and also there are some political prisoners that have spent their entire prison term in the prison and are now released during last month. So they have spent 2 years in prison, for instance, and they're not included anymore into that number.
So
It's actually interesting that when sometimes, I mean, not often, but when I come across some discussions among Russian colleagues and among just, you know, like not necessarily intellectuals, but just ordinary people, I see that inside Russia itself, it's not yet that the same state of lawlessness as in Belarus. It's just for distant observers, I think it would be just really hard to explain to which extent of lawlessness Belarus is living now. It's and every week, as Andrei said, indeed the repressions only intensified, and every week at least. I met such information just a couple of weeks ago, like at least 30, 40 people get detained. So 2 years has passed since 2020, and we see only growing numbers.
And I think one also has to mention that now on the border in Polish-Belarusian, Lithuanian-Belarusian, and Latvian-Belarusian borders, there is a high fence. So it is physically impossible to flee Belarus. And it will have very grave humanitarian consequences in case of mobilization, probably. Just because from Russia it was possible and it is still possible to escape even after the mobilization. It became much harder to escape, but it is still mostly possible. For Belarus, that would not be the case.
oh gosh. Any more questions or comments?
I wanted to ask a question to Almira, maybe, and also Pavel. No, Pavel is now in Gießen, but maybe then it's to Almira and Snezhana. And it goes back to Graham's question about the horizontal links. I like still living in Warsaw until July. I found it really remarkable to what extent this impulse coming from 2020 in Belarus changed Warsaw very much by this large influx of organized people, of people who came as Belarusians and who already had this experience of standing up together. And like in Warsaw, there were institutions in exile. There was a Belarusian house, but now we have a whole range of civil institutions, and like I found it very remarkable. And my question is, how this changed in Vilnius, Almira? Like if you compare really pre-2021 and after, from your perspective, and then of course, I found it also
about the time period from 2020, or only about recent developments.
No, I mean if there's something changed after 2021, really, when there was this large scale influx of people, and then I wanted to ask also Snezhana if this makes a difference, because you would assume that if people leave, then it's harder to, and the level of repressions is increasing all the time, as we learned, and as we see in the numbers, then it's obviously harder to uphold these horizontal links in an active way, and it is not possible to do it in public, as we also know. But does it make a difference that you have now this really large scale and highly developed horizontal links in Vilnius and in Warsaw and beyond? For you living in Minsk, does it make any difference, or are these people just missing?
I can start. Well, first of all, it's really interesting how, I mean, HU was always a kind of not closed community, but we were not many. But after 2020, and then of course over the last 1.5 years, Vilnius changed considerably, and the HU as well, because the HU now is not unique or is not alone, in a sense that actually there are many initiatives and organizations and business hubs and many things that are initiated by Belarusians. It's actually interesting that when I came to the Pradmova, this book festival, which last year was held in several countries, in Georgia, in Poland, in Lithuania, and probably somewhere else. So it actually turned out that in Vilnius, I've met almost everyone whom I used to see in Minsk when I was attending this book festival. And probably you also, if you attended some of the events in Warsaw, you also got the same feeling. So I had, for instance, I understand when we chat with our friends about this, I mean, with friends about this unusual situation, we all come to the conclusion that actually some of our friends and colleagues are in prison in Belarus, and all others, or the majority of them, are not in the country anymore. And speaking of the different initiatives, of course, there are many actions of solidarity, and there are also many new locations that are opened by Belarusians here in Lithuania. It's not only like Belarusian House or the House of Solidarity, or some particular cafes and clubs, but also it's Imaguro, the biggest business startup like organization. And just recently, probably a few months ago, I realized I'm subscribed also to Telegram channel Belarusians in Vilnius, and I just realized that actually this initiative on the дворовые чаты, on the organization, self-organization of Belarusians in the residential districts, it also moved from Belarus to Vilnius. And so I just took this to show you how it looks. That's what I found in my post box in where I live. And so actually it's really interesting that this initiative, when such an information gets circulated, it's usually 1 or 2 points. I mean, it's usually one particular point in some of the districts of Vilnius where Belarusians can meet on particular day, on particular time, and to discuss their own initiatives. So that's what moved, or what migrated with Belarusians from Belarus to Vilnius. And of course, I also want to mention the project that was initiated by Belarusian diasporas. You also might know about it, or might have heard. It's one of them is the biggest, probably one of the biggest and most ambitious projects now. It's the Digital Belarus, which is, I think it's called this way, which might be a kind of parallel digital Belarusian I wouldn't say state, but that's really like Digital Belarus, which has been developing thanks to all of these infrastructures, and that will bring together the Belarusians living now in different countries, and those who need some particular support or services and information, and that doesn't have any analogs, I think, in among other post-Soviet, or maybe not only post-Soviet diasporas. And the second initiative, which is also, in my view, is really just absolutely great. It's Mapkabai, which was, I think, Alina Koushek, the representative now of the transition committee, but before she was the journalist from Belsat, and so she was one of those people who initiated Mapkabai, and that's the map of Belarusian businesses that are located in different parts of Europe, but also in many other countries. So in case if you go to Mapkabai, you will see that you will find Belarusians, and things they do, services that then they provide, and other things on this one map. So I think it's really great.
Thank you so much for this detailed summary of what's going on vis-a-vis Lithuania and Belarus. And Snezhana?
Извиняюсь, снова я по-русски буду говорить. И постараюсь кратко, чтобы вам было легче перевести потом, Елена. Вот опять возвращаясь к вопросу о тех, кто в заключении, кто вышел, да, вот кто попал, кто прошел через через эту систему, фактически все, потом в определенной степени вынуждены себя, ограничивать в коммуникации, как бы выходить из каких-то из каких-то групп в Телеграме, где они были раньше, что-то меньше публиковать, меньше распространять информации, меньше общаться тоже вот через социальные сети, в том числе и с теми, кто вынужден был уехать. Я имею в виду тех, кто остался здесь. И вот это вот большой минус, который, конечно, ограничивает возможности получения информации и в коммуникации. И кроме того, вот чем дальше, тем больше обнаруживаю лично я, но это вот как бы мое там личное наблюдение, но я думаю, что это у большинства будет ситуация такая же, большое число коллег, знакомых, дальних знакомых, которые вот обнаруживаются, что сейчас находятся, то есть они уехали, их нет в Беларуси. И поэтому вот если как бы, постоянно, если на это обращать внимание и учитывать при проведении опросов, да, которые ведутся вот этими различными, несколькими социологическими центрами, то я думаю, что просто большое число граждан, да, большое число белорусов просто выпадают из поля этого исследования, и это кардинально меняет, или частично меняет вот эти данные, которые получаются по результатам исследования. Да. То есть мнение какой части, да, части белорусов, которые остаются здесь в Беларуси, вернее, сравнение с теми, кто остался здесь в Беларуси, и теми, кто уехал. Теми, кто сейчас за рубежом, они фактически в это исследование, да, опросов на белорусов не попадают, как я понимаю. И это вот этот минус, который стоит учитывать для Chatham House, для других центров, да, исследовательских, которые вели эти самые опросы. И опять же, если опять вернуться к тому, что у нас в Беларуси вот сейчас происходит, и если говорить про... Если вернуться к той коммуникации, которая сохраняется на вот этом горизонтальном уровне. Ой, прошу прощения, я забыла, что это необходимо переводить, поэтому, может быть, я на этом остановлюсь. То есть, да, я привыкла вот к тому, что всегда, когда приходится слушать, да, вот пойдут эти прямые переводы, а все, я останавливаюсь пока на этом.
So just in case some people do not have Russian, I want, again, very briefly, want to say that Snezhana spoke from experience when she said that those people who were detained, at least for a while, they changed their everyday tactics and strategies towards taking more precautions, cutting off participation in social networks and reducing everyday communication, because they kind of know that it may cost them, to put it bluntly. And she also emphasized that one of the obvious difficulty that one encounters is trying to make sense of the transformations of attitudes, what people in Belarus think about this and that, is that those polls which were conducted, they hardly take into consideration the attitudes of many people who had to flee the country, particularly in the course of the last 2 years. So to what extent the polls and whatever studies are being conducted are representative, to what extent they are able to grasp the complexities of people's attitudes and opinions remains an open question. Andrei, please.
Maybe just to add shortly to what Snezhana told about those distortions when surveys are conducted. It's interesting that both Chatham House and Bardamatsky's Belarusian workshop, they received more or less similar results, although the methodology was very different. And Chatham House was doing an online survey. And for both surveys, the condition was to survey people who are in Belarus now. But Chatham House did online survey, while Bardamatsky did a phone survey using fixed, what do you say it, городской телефон.
Landline.
Landline connection. And actually their results were not that different, which I think gives some credibility to those numbers. But of course, we cannot see what diaspora thinks via these surveys, but it is actually easier to survey diaspora, and this is also done. Yeah, there's been research recently on 3 diasporas of Belarusians, Georgian, Polish, and Lithuanian ones. It was more focused on discrimination, but also political attitudes were analyzed. Yeah, so these data are also available.
Many thanks. Unfortunately, our time is up, so we need to wrap up this really fascinating and precious, honestly, discussion. While listening to all these wonderful contributions, I was reminded of the notion that Natalie Koch, a human geographer, uses for analyzing Central Asia, East European countries, some East European countries. She speaks about closed contexts. Close context. So you need to make sure that you have access to this closed context. Sometimes the whole countries become this close context, and I suppose this is the case of Belarus increasingly. So it was really very important for us to hear what's going on. Felix, say goodbye. People are busy multitasking. So it was really very important for us to get together, to hear what you have to say, and let's hope that when we have a different occasion, coming conference, you all would agree to participate and we continue this conversation. Thank you so much, really appreciate it. And thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.